Welcome back to Morning Express. It's now 3 minutes after 7 local time, and it's time for the newsroom, where we look at how we members of the Fourth Estate have been doing our job. And this morning, we'd like to basically look at the state and quality of journalism in this country. But just as a quick reminder, we do remember Mohamed Amin, who is a renowned photojournalist whose images to this day still would spark up a conversation. And of course, there are those images that literally went world over and even began a cycle of things being taken. And case in point would be in Ethiopia. At the time there was hunger, there was that image that literally began World Aid Live, which was an international, people coming together to ensure that that is done. But it's just, that we ran a film yesterday of Mohamed Amin and his photojournalism journey as it was documented. But let's just get a bit of that before we begin the conversation this morning.
Colonial powers in retreat across Africa, it was happening all around him.
He was a stubborn, obstinate, determined guy.
For 28 days, he was beaten senseless, tortured, and interrogated.
For him, there was no impossible. Anything could be done.
If you want to live in the river, you go to make friends with the crocodile. This is what Amin was.
The story of a man who believed in his work and overcame every obstacle to carry it out.
When I got out of the hospital, I tried to get back to the work that I love.
What he managed to do was penetrate through all those haunting looks that were in people's eyes.
Your father, for the first time in his life, closed his office door, and he wept.
How long after takeoff did the hijackers make their move?
15 minutes.
I saw Mohamed Amin come out twice the passenger compartment in economy class and talk to some of us to try to stand up against the hijackers.
Mohamed Amin is dearly, dearly missed for what we know he could have brought to us.
And at this point, allow me now to introduce the panel that we're going to have this morning for the newsroom. To my extreme left, we have Dr. Booker, who is the Chair for Journalism and Communication in Multimedia University. Good morning, and thank you for coming.
Thank you, Michael.
Good to have you.
Yeah.
We also have Salim Amin, who is the Chair for Africa 24 Media and Camera Pics, also the son to Mohamed Amin. Good morning.
Good morning, Mike. Thanks for having me.
Joining us. And last but not least, we have Koki Ochieng, who is a lecturer for journalism and communication at the USIU. Good morning.
Morning.
All right. Let me start with you, Salim. And of course, with a backdrop of what your dad did as a photojournalist, you probably have read his journals, gone through his pictures, gone through many of the things that he did. And maybe, I don't know, maybe you remember some of the stories you had with him. What would you say was the passion that drove him to the point where he executed such professionalism and created a conversation and a debate with his photojournalism?
I think there was a number of different reasons for what he did. He grew up in a very poor family and a very poor background, and I don't think he enjoyed poverty. I don't think anybody enjoys poverty, but he specifically didn't. So there was also an angle of him not wanting to be in that position and wanting to be a success. He also realized at a very early age the power of imagery and what it could do. From the time that he was in high school, he saw it not just as a way to have a revenue, but also how to change the conversation, how to highlight some of what he saw as injustices at that time. He grew up at a time when independence was coming into the continent, so there was a lot going on here. His commitment and his passion, I think a lot of it grew from the fact that he was an Asian growing up at a time when, as I said, independence was happening, so the white rule was going away. African leaders were coming into power. But as an Asian, he was neither here nor there. So all he ever grew up listening to and hearing was no. Every time he wanted to do something, it was like, no, you can't do this, you can't photograph this, you can't go in here. And he just, that resilience just built up over time, where he hated people telling him he couldn't do certain things, and so he wanted to do everything.
And I think even from the footage and some of the images we've seen, there are times we'd even be literally moved away from the main dais, but he would not.
He would always come back.
Without a fight.
They would always look around, and he'd be right back there where he was. And there, I hear a lot of these stories from people that are still working with us, that were with him, and some fantastic. He had such a great relationship with some of the leaders in the continent, with Jomo Kenyatta and with Julius Nyerere, even with people like Idi Amin and Bukasa, and that kind of, I think it's very different how the media is now, in terms of the relationship they had, because they all covered. There weren't that many media people, so they would always be at every event, every summit,
any major event,
they would always be there, whether it was Uhuru Day or Kenyatta Day in those days, any parade at Uhuru Park. They would always be at these events, and they would always joke and laugh, and they would have these conversations between the media and the heads of state.
Okay.
And I think that's missing these days.
All right. Now, journalists are commonly referred to or thought to be stubborn. Would you describe your father as having been stubborn?
Oh, absolutely. He was stubborn. He was the most stubborn person I've ever had the privilege of knowing.
Okay.
It was that passion, is that he just wanted to do something that would make a difference. He wanted to tell stories about people that weren't able to tell their own story.
Okay.
And he would do anything to get that story. And he loved the exclusive, like any journalist should. He wanted to be the only one with that story. He wanted to have the exclusivity, but there was also a very human and compassionate side about telling that.
All right, we'll come back to you. Let me come to you, Dr. Booker, and possibly reflecting and looking at Mohamed Amin's journey in journalism. Have we dropped the ball?
I think first of all, before I respond, is just to commemorate his work on this day and his contribution. I think that's an immense contribution to journalism, and we cannot ignore that. Have we dropped? Yes, in certain instances we have. When you look at his life story and the kind of things that he did and the stories that he covered, it was much more than just being able to be the first one to get the scoop,
that story,
and get the story and having the exclusivity to stories, but that he was driven, by passion and going that extra mile, no matter what it took, for him to get those stories. Even for him to cover the Ethiopian story, it took him 6 months, for example, to be able to get access to that. When he covered, the shooting of Tom Mboya, for example, he got into the ambulance with him as he was being taken to hospital. And so when I look at that and I read about it and listen to stories about his contribution, I ask myself, are we there? Do we have that kind of journalist who would be so persistent, no matter what it takes, to be able to tell that story? And in some instances, yes, we have some of those people that we can make reference to, but what we learned from the life of Amin and his contribution to journalism was that he even died, I think, telling a story. And I think one of the reasons why, for example, he tried to negotiate with the hijackers in the plane was, if he lived to tell that story, it would have been a big story, Unfortunately, he didn't. And he died telling that story. He made headlines even with his death. Do we have that today? Not to the extent that he contributed.
All right. Koki, what happened? What is it that we were not able to take over from Mohamed Amin? He definitely is an inspiration to this day. And like Dr. Booker mentions, he literally still made headlines. And I think he still would make headlines even now as we commemorate 10 years? 20 years. What went wrong?
I think it's just the way things have changed generally in the profession, the way we are considered as a profession, and what we do to protect our profession. As it is, like Mohamed said, previously you would find journalists actually being the real fourth estate. And if you look back into the history of journalism, you say media is a fourth estate to the other three estates. So at least at that time or point in time, the kind of reverence the profession had, of course, gave people more opportunity to tell stories and have them aired. Today, I think if you're brave enough and if you're stubborn to live on, at some point there are so many factors. The media is not journalism friendly, I'm sorry to say so. Again, you find that there are political influences. Again, the leaning of most of the stories, like we were speaking with Amin earlier, is political. So opportunities to tell human stories or give a human face to an issue really has just fallen back to the investigative journalists, who again, we've seen have vacated mainstream media. So we are left with telling news, the only genre that exists, and of course then the other genres have been put aside.
Okay, Salim, and you're still in the business of training and churning out journalists at Africa 24, and in fact the director is telling me that, you know, I must mention that he went to your school, and as a result he ended up, I think, in Bloomberg. So you're still doing that. Where do you think there's that disconnect? Because I would imagine that the fact that you have that experience through your father and seeing what he had done, we should be able to infuse that same discipline and passion in the journalists that we churn out. However, there seems to be a disconnect somewhere.
Well, I think, I mean, when we started the Mohamed Amin Foundation, you know, 20 odd years ago, the kind of journalists and students we put through that over the years were quite exceptional. And that was also because it was a not-for-profit organization. We could pick and choose a small number of students that had passed quite extensive criteria and then train them for an extended period of time. I think what happens in the major universities, and Nancy can well, both my colleagues here can either contest that or not, is it's become mass-produced. Journalism training has become mass-produced. It's become a business, as it should be. I mean, it has to make money at some point. At some point, but yes. I think there's too many journalists that are being churned out at the moment. There's too many people doing media and communications. I think the institutions are not as well equipped or as well resourced as they should be. I think there is a lack of opportunity in the media space once these students graduate. So you can have loads of journalists coming out, they can be reasonably well trained, but if they have nowhere to go to get mentorship, to learn, because even what they learn in university, once they take it to the workplace, it's a completely different environment. So a mentorship program, internship programs that allow journalists to get an idea of what they're going to be facing in the real world as opposed to what they learn in the classroom is very, very important. And I don't think enough media organizations take on interns and really nurture them and then hire them and take them through that whole cycle. Young people these days, and again, it's a generalization, so I don't want it to be a criticism of all young people.
All millennials,
but,
as they're called now.
Yeah, but they don't seem to have the same sort of work ethic that was 20 or 30 years ago. At the time of my father's work ethic, like I said, we still have people that used to work with him, and those people are still the hardest working people in our organization. Even now. They're still the ones who are in their 60s now, and they still have a better work ethic than young people who seem to think that because they've gone to university, they have all the knowledge, and they should be given a big position as soon as they come out, and be allowed to be on Facebook for 7 hours of the day chatting to their friends, and they can't see a problem with that. And that's a concern that I have, is that work ethic and the attitude of young graduates.
But I think I can contest a bit and justify, the existence of some very good, pretty good journalists who are very young and upcoming, self-driven. More or less, most of the students who we find starting their career while in first year. So you find that by the time they're in fourth year, they basically have established themselves as journalists. The problem is the penetration into the media space becomes a challenge, because the media house, like we've said, or media space is narrow in terms of being able to employ, and of course for them to get funding, to get equipment of their own, or spaces to do editing, and all that becomes very expensive. So you find that again, in terms of competing interests, parents want that after you do your degree, you get a job. I have one in my house, and I'm already telling him, in January, you've got to get something going. So if they don't find something that's really similar to their passion, then they end up falling out of the profession, and you end up with other people who probably try to, just do what they can.
Well, just to add on, sorry, just to add on to that, in terms of what we're doing with Africa 24 Media, and this is, we'll segue right into what Nancy is about to say, I think, is the relationship and partnership we have with the Multimedia University is quite unique in that we have our entire production set up within the university. So it's a private-public partnership, I think the first of its kind on the continent, where an independent company has gone into a university. Set up there, and is helping them develop their curriculum, but also providing short courses and an internship place for Multimedia University students and students from other universities as well. And this, I think, has to be expanded. We're experimenting at the moment. I think we have a lot of things that we need to get right. But what Koki was saying was exactly that they have the work experience. While they're learning, they have the work experience as well. And that's something that, it's very difficult to, it needs to be replicated more.
Dr. Buka.
Yeah, let me just comment, on some of the things that, Salim has raised. When you look at the life of his father, that it was not just about paying the bills. Of course, that was important. But where did it start? With a passion and a calling. And I think when you look at most of our celebrated media personalities and journalists, for many of them, it was not about the money. It was about, a call to serve, a call to make a difference, a call to action in very many of the stories that they told. So much so that, in certain instances, they would even cry as a result of the stories that they told. His father cried, when he watched, the kind of pictures that he had taken about what was happening in Ethiopia. And you then realize that the motivation there is much bigger than just, getting a job and being able to get an income out of it. Of course, as a result of that, he won awards, was able to, change his life and get out of poverty and make a name for, for himself. What we have today, and I think it's something that, also generational, that for many of our young people, that they want to, get there as fast as they can without understanding that this is a process. His dad started this journey when he was 11, when he bought his first camera, and that, did it for a very long time. And that persistence, I think, is what is missing. Because what we are lacking is that mentorship, somebody to hold their hand and tell them, it doesn't come that easy, it doesn't come that fast. It takes time, it takes a lot of resilience and persistence, to be able to get there. One of the things that we have worked with Salim and his team on campus is that our students get a mentorship program through the internship. And it's one of those things that they really, really value, because seeing these guys on campus, shadowing them, during their internship and, following them and seeing the kind of stories that they tell, editing with them, learning the tough lessons, being told off when they don't do a good job. It's never easy. It's not for the faint-hearted, And they come out of it. Of course, some of them feel it's too hard, but many of them come out of it and appreciate, that after all is said and done, the kind of teaching and the training that we do can only go so far, But for them to be able to make that difference, then somebody has to be able to mentor them.
And to hold their hand.
And to hold their hand to get to that point. Of course, we must also take into account that for many young people today, and that's why journalism programs have so many students, they think that's the next big thing. That's where they need to go. So you find, the competing interests. As universities, you want to be able to, break even, and you know.
You need the numbers.
You need the
to,
numbers
to pay the bills.
to be able to
you
do that.
definitely do.
But then, as you do that, of course, there are those who will stand out as, you know, as students. There are those who in their first semester will come and tell you, first year, you know, that I want to do this, how can I do it? And I think we need to be able to encourage them and tell them that, you know, with a digital platform, there is so much that you can do. When you look at most of the celebrated journalists and those who have won awards, particularly the photojournalists, they worked independently. You know, they were not tied to media houses, which tells us something. You know, that does one have to get out to be able to do that?
To do that.
Look at Joseph Madenge, for example, and his contribution, even with the Westgate story. He was hired by 2 media houses, but lost his job, you know. And we only came to celebrate him after you know, telling the Westgate story and winning an award.
And as you answer or maybe give continuation to that, maybe these students pass through your hands and there's a sudden increase in terms of numbers of students who want to become journalists. Could it be that they have the wrong perspective of what journalism is all about? Maybe there is this, because of the information age, we have this idea that it's a place, you know, where you'll be celebrated, you'll become a celebrity, you become famous. Could that be the wrong drive that's getting them there?
Yeah, you're picking my thoughts. My very thoughts.
I read your mind.
Yeah, I think basically the glamorization of, if I may call it that way, making the whole process look glamorized affects the perception of many students. It's only until they get to later years in their studies that they realize that it's not that easy. At our university, basically, towards the end, you have the students doing projects. You find somebody sitting through a project for 13 weeks and is not able to piece it together because of the difficulty of working, you know, alone by themselves to make sure something really comes out of, you know, a media product comes out. Again, the internships they get, in so much as we talk about the internships in the industry, they seem, at least from what I've heard, they seem not to really get the real feel of mentorship because it's just numbers of people who've gone into the media house and they're, you know, tossed around. They don't really get that one person assigned to them to give them that one-on-one perspective of what it really takes to be a journalist. Again, why are there numbers of students doing journalism? You realize that the curriculum provides for majorly 3 concentrations. You have some of them doing PR, some of them doing development communication, and some of them doing broadcast. That combines TV and radio and print. So then most of the students don't want to go to the difficult part of writing or telling stories, and they don't know that that component becomes important in all aspects of those concentrations. So again, maybe to add value, the numbers. Surely if we have a school, a journalism school that might have 1,500 journalists, and we have how many media houses?
Only half a dozen.
Yeah, half a dozen.
But then again, an interesting point that Dr. Booker brought up is that most of those celebrated journalists are not necessarily attached to a media house.
Yes.
They're most of them independent.
Yes.
So the media houses, okay, are a place where they can be offered mentorship and an opportunity to grow, but not the only.
But you need the media houses in order to have your content out. You see, again, whether you're a photojournalist, you're a print journalist, you're doing TV, you need somewhere to put that content.
Yeah.
Things are changing because of social media and because of the internet and the fact that journalists can be self-published now on all these different platforms. But you need to still have the support, I think, on this continent in particular, to have the support of the big media houses in order to get your stories out there. So at some point, all of them, whereas people like Boniface Mwangi and others, all been through the major media houses at some point. You know, my father, when he started, used to just go and, you know, drop pictures off the Tanganyika Standard or The Nation and others, you know, and give them that content because he needed to have the pictures out there.
Yeah, I think, we can bypass the media house. But then again, there is the professionalism, the etiquette, the processes and procedures and HR processes that you need to know of when you're within a media space, a media house.
Dr. Booker, looking at the media houses now, and we are members of the Fourth Estate, and we are called the Fourth Estate for a reason. Has the fact that it's become such an expensive exercise possibly made us compromise the quality of what we churn out? Because at the end of the day, it is so expensive and bills must be paid. I mean, and maybe just to add value to that, you mentioned that the story that Mohamed Amin did in Ethiopia took 6 months. How many media houses are willing to...
It took him like 6 months to get entry.
To get entry.
To be able to
How many media houses are willing to keep you following up a story for 6 months and for it to come out, and it may not?
It's an interesting observation that you're making right there. That when you look at most of the stories that Mohamed Amin did, they were not, overnight.
It was not an overnight story.
It's not something that he woke up and by the end of the day he had a story. There were a few of those instances where he stumbled on photographs that would tell a good story. But there are many other instances where it took time. It took a lot of resilience to be able to do that. It took a lot of investment, to be able to do that. In some of those stories, he lost his arm, to be able to tell that story. And, would media houses then be able to afford, that amount of time to tell those stories? It would take much more. And I think we must also appreciate the fact that we are seeing some very good investigative pieces coming out of media houses. I think we need to appreciate that. But even for the journalists who do those investigative pieces, and when you talk to them, it takes much more than just, making a headline. That they have to spend time, they have to invest, their personal resources, that something has to give for them to be able to do that. When you look at his father's life, a lot of sacrifices were made, including coming late to your wedding, I think. Because it was an important story. For Joseph Madenge, for example, he had to miss his friend's wedding where he was supposed to be the official photographer. Something has to give. Now, what lesson do we learn from that even as media houses? That something has to give if we have to be, that fourth estate that is still very highly regarded, by members of the public. People trust media, People have a lot of value and a lot of attachment to that which media tells us. And it calls for a lot of persistence. I think we are seeing a bit of that even in some of the investigative pieces that are coming through, with some of the stories that are being followed. I know sometimes we might get tired of, why is this story being dragged on and on and on, but that's the persistence that we need if you're going to make a difference. And so, even in terms of balancing, the profitability or the profit angle and the business sense of media houses, we shouldn't lose focus of why we exist in the first place in society.
Maybe to...
Salim.
Well, again, just, Kogo mentioned earlier, we seem to concentrate so much on politics here, rather than these investigative pieces and following up all of these stories, which takes time, which takes effort. And we have such a, unfortunately, in this country, every day there's a new scandal. So there's so much material that the old ones are forgotten. You're constantly, got a new headline of some new scandal or scam that's happening. And what I find is lacking is this follow-up of the older stories. Is what happened to these particular scandals that happened? Did anyone go to jail? I think the public wants to know. And I don't think media houses put enough emphasis on following up, because it's expensive to keep doing it. And they have limited resources, and they want to keep up to date with the latest scandals and scams, and we seem to provide that. But even in the international media, the international media has got a bad reputation for telling only negative stories about Africa. And it keeps coming up at every discussion one has, that the international media still portrays Africa as a continent of famine and genocide, corruption and war, etc. Coups and stuff like that. Now, again, we have to take a step back as African media and say, well, why is it the international media's responsibility to tell our stories? We should be doing that job ourselves. We should be doing it so well that they shouldn't be international media bureaus in our countries. They should be taking our content and running those stories.
And why do you think it is that we haven't gotten to that point where we actually have international media houses setting up their own offices here, whereas we're here?
Because, I think it's the lack of training and opportunity in that space. I think we still haven't been able to prove, or the international media still thinks that we don't have the ability to be able to tell stories of their standard. which I think is completely false. I think it's completely false.
Maybe.
And my father proved that. Well, my father proved that for 40 years. He but in those days the credit of the story still went to the correspondent, who happened to be a white English BBC journalist. He never got the credit for Ethiopia, for Idi Amin, for all of these things. It took a lot of fighting on his part to get that credit. Because they were his stories, his contacts, his knowledge, local knowledge, and obviously his camera work that got it. And this, I think, is something we have to constantly keep proving to ourselves first, so that your average Kenyan doesn't go to the BBC first or to CNN first for a local story, but comes to the Standard Group or Nation or K24 or KTN News, exactly, and comes there. But we have to prove it. We have to beat them every single day.
I think for me it's more the challenge of the business model that the media houses are using. And if you look at it from a business perspective, if your main source of revenue is advertising, then you don't have space for content. But if you look at the media products, the content as a product, a business product, then you invest enough money into developing content that is of quality, then the international people can come around looking at it. But I imagine the kind of investment you'll have to put into that will be colossal. Let me just give you an example. We have the Africa Magic, and you understand how it started. Basically, MultiChoice had to put a lot of money into production, recruit production teams, and get the content out. And now they have sufficient African content. So I'm believing that with a change of the business model in terms of generating revenue from content and other PR kind of activities that would surround that, then the media has a better chance of survival, especially in this era of digital migration.
And not losing our people as well, because again, we train them, and we bring them to us, and then we lose the best because we can't afford to pay them what they can get paid by the big media houses internationally. And that's something that somehow, I know it boils down to business and economics, but it's something that we have to try and rectify, because good journalists will stay. They all want to come back home, even those that have gone overseas. They all want to come back home. And at some point, it's not about the money anymore. It's really about what their passion is and what they want to do. So they will come back, but they still need to make a living. So they still need to be given a package that will at least satisfy them, if not what.
And I think just to add on to that, sometimes when you read and you follow what's happening in media and you see, the mass exodus of some of the big names, it pains us, because these are the mentors, these are the people who should be holding the hands of, the upcoming journalists. So it calls for, a lot of rethinking in terms of
in terms of how the model comes out. Now, let's look at social media, because that's another angle that has affected or infused a certain energy in media, and especially now in terms of journalism. And unfortunately, we seem sometimes to be following what social media is happening to get our content. How do we go around that? Because at the end of the day, we must maintain the professionalism of a journalist. The reason why, for instance, my father would buy the newspaper is because the newspaper was gospel truth. Why? Because it was a journalist. Now we've kind of changed the narrative where you have some papers posting something or putting a story and apologizing the next day. Or sources that do not want to be quoted. What happens, and how do we use social media to our advantage rather than it eroding the professionalism of journalism?
I think if you look at the studies around social media and traditional media, we call it new media and traditional media, the relationship is like Siamese twins. Really, we source for information from either or. You find that social media people are waiting for the media. You're also in mainstream media waiting for social media. But the validity of traditional media is that what is heard on social media is verified on traditional media. If only the media would get that sense, that even if a story starts on social media, people wait for verification from traditional media, then you have... because people understand the process, the gatekeeping process, the filter then publish process. Unlike social media where it is publish that filter. Somebody comes up with a judgment and that's it. So I think media should not feel threatened. I wrote something on a journalist, a blogger's journalist, and the arguments are totally different out there, because the argument for the bloggers is basically they are there as people, private people, giving their opinion. But the argument for journalism is that before you churn out information, it goes through all those editorial processes. It goes through the gathering, the verification, and distribution that is verified.
All right, Dr. Buka.
Let me just add to that. I like what Koki says about looking at the legacy media as being the point at which, information is verified, but not just even verified, extended. The conversation is extended, a lot of follow-ups, then take place. And that's because for many of the people that are working in newsrooms, they know, what is it that would make for a story? What is it that people are looking for? Sometimes when it is on social media, and again, depending on who the source is, they might not have that advantage of knowing how do I package the story. But having said that, I think what needs to happen is the legacy media or media houses as we've known them must also then have that online presence. They must be there because, like it or not, we cannot ignore, that space. It's where, everybody is moving to. It's, where we go to, to find information, breaking stories. I no longer turn on the TV to find what's a breaking story like I used to. We no longer have special editions of the newspaper coming out in the afternoon, to break a story. That's the space. So the mainstream, the legacy media or the media houses must also have that presence. And the truth is that I will go onto KTN's, social site and find that information. I want to find it there. I would rather go there than go onto somebody that I don't know. But we cannot also ignore the bloggers. They are an important entity. Some of them have been practicing journalists, so they know how to be able to tell a story. So I think it's working on, how do we coexist rather than how do we, work separately.
Okay. Yeah. And Salim, as you're answering that or, adding to that, let's also look at the values that we have today as journalists, because I think one of the things that would ensure a story is credible and verified before you post it is the fact that as a journalist, you felt that your name is at stake if you publish something that is not true, just based on your value system. But that seems to have changed.
Absolutely. I mean, I think even, again, the media houses need to rethink how they operate. Social media is here to stay. There is going to be very rarely will a major news story break that is going to be because of a journalist. It's going to be because of somebody that has a mobile phone that happens to be at an airport, or happens to be somewhere where a bomb goes off, or happens to be somewhere where a celebrity passes out or dies or does something. It's very rarely going to be a journalist on the ground. So I think we as journalists and media houses in particular need to rethink how they're telling these. One, you've got a different audience. You've got an audience that is very young, has a very short attention span. So we need to change the way we tell those stories as well. Those people will come to us because they believe in our reputation. They will see something on social media, and then they will want to get more information and perhaps more validity by coming to a traditional media house, because we've established that reputation. I'm not sure that we're there yet. I'm not sure that they do come back to us, because at this point we haven't proved that we know more than the people out there in blogging and in the virtual space. So we need to do that. And again, something that Nancy said, do we know what stories young people really want to hear? Now that's another thing, that we are very traditional still, I think, and I put myself in that space. I'll give you an example from a couple of weeks ago or a month ago. Kim Kardashian being robbed in Paris. People were laughing in the newsrooms when this story came in, thinking that, oh God, this is ridiculous. And they thought it's just another, it'll be a 2-minute piece and that's gone. For 2 days, this was the single largest story in the world that ran. The single largest on every media outlet. Now, that to me says that the priorities, unfortunately, priorities have shifted for young people. So we as media traditional media journalists and houses need to adjust the way we tell those stories, maybe figure out a different angle to it.
And also looking at the number of young people we have, I think they're higher than the older people.
Absolutely.
Maybe
So we really need to rethink how we do things, and I think we have to get off this high horse of ours that we are, here to stay, because we're not here to stay.
All right.
Maybe just to add on to that, I don't think media house should ever be threatened that online platforms or online
will take over.
I just think that they should enhance the platforms, because the platforms are there to actually tell stories from the traditional media. I mean, if you put up your platform, you basically are putting on a video, which has to be edited, go through the same process. If you're looking at the story, it has to go through the same process. So for me, I don't see it like a threat. It's just a platform.
Or could it be that there is, because of competition, we are quick to want to be the first one to break the story. So you try and shortchange or shortcut the process of verifying and ensuring that you have a full, complete story, that now you want to be the first one to break the story.
But breaking the story does not mean you'll be the last with the story. I think that's what the mantra should be, because you're going to pick something, like he said, from someone who observed directly and who is a pseudo-journalist, actually, who was at the scene. So what do you need to do then? You need to tell that story from different angles so that you get different dimensions.
And still make it interesting and appealing to a young audience.
I think what we see oftentimes is just, some of that content being lifted off, somebody's social media and, put on the newspapers and
as a story,
just as it is, without verification, fact checking, and
background.
Not even that. The process of sending out journalists to follow up one issue, has changed. You might need to integrate more information from the internet, enhance your research departments so that they look at things from different perspectives. Just tell stories from different perspectives.
Just to build up on that point, I think it's also very important that media houses start investing in specialist journalists. To have people that have a speciality, that business is their speciality, or sports, or fashion, or art, or health, or whatever it might be. Because at the moment, it seems like, again, because of budgetary reason. Politics, everybody's an expert in this country on politics. But for budgetary reasons, they don't have specialist journalists. So you've got, a journalist doing a political story in the morning, a sports story at lunchtime, and going to interview a CEO on mining in the evening. And it's the same journalist because he or she has been given those many assignments during the day. There is a lack of dedicated personnel, and they don't get any of them right because they just don't have the time, number one, and they don't have the expertise to do that.
And Dr. Bukka, as we're looking at that, specializing, and one of the areas that maybe I would like you to comment on is research. Because you'll find when you go to some of the major media houses, for instance, CNN or, what would consider the more grown media houses, you'll find that they have a dedicated desk for research. And this gives, whether it's the journalist or the story, a lot of history and information that builds and gets that credibility of the journalist. Are we getting there in Kenya in terms of research? Just having a research desk for whatever area?
Well, that's where I started off as working in the media. That I was thrown at the back, doing research, going through, the newspaper library, what they would call the morgue at the time, to get information. Wasn't glamorous at all. That's not what I paid up for. My parents wanted to see me on TV almost immediately. Now they can. But it took a lot longer. It took a lot longer for me to be able to get to that point. And I think part of it is also, I think most of the research that we do today is a lot more online. That when we verify online, but we are not even checking from what source, is that report or that information. We are not even doing a second verification of the source from which we are getting that information. And I think that needs to change. That, research is much more than just, clicking a few keys here and there and, a lot of information comes up. Even being able to to sift through that information that is available online and asking what's credible, from this online research, that is being done. But I think we also must appreciate where we have come from and where we are going. I think we are seeing very good stories. There might not be as many as we would want them because we have a lot of space. And I think when you look at the space vis-a-vis the kind of quality, then there is a disconnect there. But we need to appreciate the fact that there are examples of very, very good stories, some that have even gone ahead to win CNN awards and some of the very prestigious awards locally and even abroad. And that needs to be celebrated. The challenge, however, is would we be able to keep, those journalists, as Salim said,
I think the integration of research and a serious integration of research into the journalism training is very, very important. And I can attest in USIU, basically review our curriculum as often. And one of the key aspects that we think needs a lot of attention, to the extent that you want to have like almost 2 semesters of research, because you want to make sure that they have experience in understanding organizational research, they have experience in understanding media monitoring and doing research based on that, they have experience in understanding how to do a perfect situational analysis that will give them enough information to build their scripts and their treatments on. So I think, again, it goes back to the curriculum and the attention that we in the universities or whichever training school there is gives to the research process. And of course, the space. Everybody wants to fit themselves in the media space. So you want to know that if I become a communication researcher, or a media researcher, will I get space in the media house?
I think, again, we live in a very different time. Nancy talked earlier about, my dad sometimes taking 6 months or so to get a story or working on something. We live in a cycle. We used to be 24-hour news a few years ago. Now it's 24-minute news. You need an update every few seconds, and that gives researchers, gives journalists very little time to keep feeding this monster that is the online space now, because again, even major media outlets are always online tweeting or updating on major breaking stories. So the lack of time that we have to actually tell stories, I think, is very problematic. And we need to somehow figure out how we can do it when people like John Allen Namu and others spend time doing these panorama type of documentaries. You can see the quality and the impact that they have, but even they're pressed for resources, for time, and to keep up with this, with people wanting to know something every few seconds.
All right, Dr. Buka, as we are winding up, maybe would like to hear from you, because time is really against us here. What is it that you would like to see transformed and changed when it comes to our way of doing our stories, our report? More human interest stories? We are very political, and I'm not sure whether Kenya is a political country like we might like to make it, or is it the politicians that have literally hijacked the newsrooms and made it their platform for getting their agenda across?
Well, that would take a different, it would need you to call us here.
A whole show,
An entire show. Politicians and media.
Yes, and of course, because there are many factors at play, the political interests in, some of the media houses and all that. But going back to your question, what is it that that I would like to see different or reinforced? I followed the life of his dad, because I needed to convince my parents that I needed to do journalism. And that was the only way that I could do that around that time. But one of the things that, we get from him is it was not just the bad that sold, that there were lots of stories that he told about the African culture, the African way of life, the food, so many things that he's talked about and, told the world about Africa. It was not just, the blood. And I think, even for us in terms of training, that's where it needs to start. Inculcating in our students, the journalists of tomorrow, that it doesn't need to be bloody for it to to lead, you know, that you can lead with very good stories. It doesn't need to be political for it to make the headlines. There is so much, you know, that is being told out there that's outside of politics, but still very, very important stories. And going back to, you know, having them determining what is it that makes them excited. It could be health, it could be issues about children, issues about women, you know, issues about sports, for example, which oftentimes does not have a political inclination. I think what happens is that sometimes very good stories that should be totally separated from politics, you know, that we find a way of connecting it and giving it a political angle. And that needs to change.
That needs to change.
Yeah.
Salim, possibly what you'd like to see on our screens, on our print?
Again, I think very similar to what Nancy said. I'd like to see different stories told with passion. Journalists that are telling stories about things that are very close to them personally. I don't see a problem with making things personal. I mean, oftentimes we're taught that, you know, we have to be objective and unbiased. I think the world has changed, that we also need to get involved. People want to see that the journalists are affected by the work that they're doing, and that gives them more of a human face and more passion. And, you know, I think this idea of developing more mentors and having a much closer relationship with media houses, between media universities and media houses, and building that relationship, allowing people to be mentored, to build networks and connections between the two areas, because they are symbiotic and you have to be able to work together. I think that to see more of that would be only beneficial to our industry.
All right, Koki?
For me, the media has to change its business model, and it has to, you know, look at content as a business product. For me, that's where it all starts. The media has to invest sufficient monies, not probably to have their own production, but to have young and entrepreneurial producers and directors do their thing and sell the content to the media houses, or at least integrate the advertising aspect and marketing aspect to it. Secondly, I think we are at an era where the training must make sure that most journalists are multifunctional, in the sense that they can look at the process from the beginning to the end, and they can be able to sufficiently well enough do all that partakes to tell a story, or all that partakes, basically to tell a story.
All right.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you very much. I think we'll have to wind it up right there because of time. That's Koki Ochieng, who is lecturer in journalism and communications, USIU. We also have Salim Amin, who's the chair for Africa 24 Media and also Camera Picks. Thank you for joining us this morning. And last but not least, Dr. Nancy Booker, who's the chair for Department of Journalism and Communication, Multimedia University. Thank you. That's where we wind up morning, not Morning Express, but Newsroom. I'm going ahead of myself here.